I will go back a little bit more to theory than the other speakers maybe. So we are speaking about values, of course, design principles, and I would love to start with a beginning thesis that we can define the values of our urban environment when we understand the logics of the structures of our cities. And to do so, I will start a little bit in the history. So, in medieval times, our cities in Europe were clearly constituted or defined by a very clear separation inside, and inside was a city very dense, and outside was a landscape. And in the typologies inside the city, there was no separation between working and living. In the time of enlightenment, cities, it was a very short period, cities started growing, and architects and planners at that time had already the idea that a city can be something inside a park. But then the industrial revolution started. And with the Industrial Revolution, our cities grew very, very fast, and based on an orthogonal street system defining building fields, the building fields occupied by or divided to several small parcels, and on that parcels, individual investors, families, built their houses. This led to very, very dense urban structures. Today, these are in our cities the most popular quarters. But at that time, you have to imagine, living and working was next to each other. The people at the beginning of the time of industrialization, they had to walk to their working place. And all the power station, all the heating, all the cooking was done with coal oven. So it was very dirty, very much polluted. And the living conditions, especially for the poor living in the most dense areas, were very critical. And this situation led to new ideas for urban development. And at the same time, with the industrialization, new technical innovations took place. So, public transport, street trains, suburban trains were developed, and suddenly there was a situation that people were able to have a longer distance between the places where they worked or where they lived. And this led to new ideas. And there was the first time, I'm referring here to Berlin, my hometown, beginning of the 20th century, the idea to link the landscape with the city, more or less like we have seen it right now in Aarhus. At that time, and there was the idea that with linking this, nature, better air can be brought into the city, and on the other side, people can live outside and go to the inner city with the public transport, live in better, healthy living condition outside. So this was the start of modern urban development, with these ideas of separation of functions. At that time, maybe there was no other solution. Today, we know we can live and work in the same place next door to working places, because today our industries, our working places are very clean. So we can mix working and living again. At the same time, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of movements, political movements, working class movements, democratic reforms, and also on the building sector, significant changes took place. Until this time, all the construction of living buildings were normally done by private people. And then with the social reforms, there was the idea to build social housing, or to build housing with housing associations. Martin Wagner and Bruno Taut were one of the pioneers for this. Maybe you know the Horseshoe settlement in Berlin, which is now a heritage. It was a new residential area only for living, with some small shops for the daily use and a kindergarten and a school, but monofunctional at the edge of the city. To live there with your own garden, with in such a neighborhood, in a totally new situation, and commute with the public transport to the inner city or to the working places. At the beginning of the 20th century, from my perspective, there were two most important volumes or theoretic approaches which had the strongest impact to the urban development during the last century. On the one hand side, you know Ebenezer Howard and his idea of a garden city. This was the initial for this longing of the people to live in individual one-family houses with their own garden. And we had a lot of developments following this idea, living outside the city in a garden. On the other hand, there was this idea to transform the inner city to an urban landscape with modern buildings. Here you see the drawing of Le Corbusier for the Ville Radieuse. And this had also a very strong impact to the transformation of our inner cities. In Berlin, after the Second World War, Hans Scharoun and his team proposed a plan to transform the whole city to a city following these ideas, based mainly on individual vehicle mobility. So with inner city highways, with a network of inner city highways. We are still suffering from that. And they had an idea to transform also the inner city to a new idea of a city with individual, or with buildings, just keeping the monuments, and the rest of the city in a more open structure. I will give you an illustration for that. There was the International Building Exhibition in Berlin, 1957, for the Hansa Quarter. And here you can see the Hansa Quarter before the war, and here you see the structure. On the left-hand side, the traditional structure, like we heard many times during these days, with small parcels, with a clear separation. What is a public street? What are the individual parcels with the individual buildings, with the common backyards, etc. And the new idea for an urban landscape with solitaire standing buildings. And here I'm coming to this, here we see this in bird view perspectives. And here I'm coming to what Anton mentioned. Here we can see two totally different approaches of our urban environment. On the one hand side, the traditional town, here with this ground figure plan of Parma, where the buildings are defining the streets, where they are defining the public spaces. It's the city of the space definers, like Colin Rowe and Fred Kötter explained in their volume Collage City. And on the other hand side, you see a composition of solitaire standing houses for an urban landscape, like Corbusier proposed here for Saint-Dié in France. And we can also compare this just on the building level. On the one hand side, you have the space occupier, like the Unité Habitation von Le Corbusier, and the Uffizien in Florence. They have the same size, but they are a space where the people are moving in. So, a totally opposite approach of dealing with our cities. And following these ideas of modern urbanism, many parts of our cities were transformed and new areas were built. This was the first large prefabricated housing component in Berlin, in the inner city, directly east of the Alexanderplatz. You see this open structure with these large building slabs following these ideas of modern urbanism. But the same happened in the West. But in the 1970s, they started a lot of critique to this urban development. It was clear that it's too expensive, we cannot transform the whole city in that way. The people also demonstrated against this transformation because they prefer to stay in their old neighborhoods. There were a lot of house squattering, etc. Here, this is examples from Berlin-Kreuzberg, maybe you heard about. And there was also a new building exhibition, finding new approaches, dealing with the city after this experience of modern urbanism. And this was also based on this general critiques, like we heard today from Kees Christiansen, that Jane Jacobs was very much inspiring him, because she explained really what are the structures which make life in a city good. Of course, also architects proposed their first ideas how the city should look like in the future. And in this international building exhibition, there were two parts. It was the International Building Exhibition New, with a guideline of the critical reconstruction of the traditional urban fabric, with a clear separation of streets, public parks, places, and on the other hand, buildings, fields with separated parcels with individual housing typologies. And there was the approach of dealing with the historic quarters, following the idea of a cautious rehabilitation. This was the result of a process, a planning process, debates, clashes, workshops, etc., about several years. And then they decided, okay, we will have this cautious rehabilitation of our old historic district, which was a district of the time of the industrialization and the early industrialization. And there was no master plan. They decided on 12 principles as the framework, as the basis for the development. So there was a consensus, okay, we will accept these 12 principles, and with these 12 principles, we will have a lot of individual measures. So it was the opposite of the idea before, having general standards and then a master plan to do it, having guidelines, having a vision, having principles for the development, and then plot by plot, house by house, finding the best solution concerning the needs of the people living there, the potential of the building, the situation of the building, how the people who were living there can participate in the process, etc., etc. So plot by plot, very individual, but not isolated under the frame of these 12 principles. Yeah, today Kreuzberg is one of the most popular and unfortunately also one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Berlin. And this experience more or less also guided the urban development during the decades after the unification. I don't want to go into this now, but I would like to go to, don't see the time now, to a few principles I would like to share with you from this experience. Of course, we heard this several times, our cities exist, so the main tasks are taking place inside our existing cities. Of course, sustainability is a basis of our development. We heard this today. Density, mixture of function, polycentric development is very important. But there are also some principles we can use and we should be aware about to develop our cities. Here's just one example, old industrial site in Chernivtsi. I worked there for several years, and this was the approach to transform the old industrial area to a new mixed housing and residential area. So we identified what is the most important location, places, junctions in this area, how they are linked with each other, and how we can create from this system a basic structure for the further development. More or less, this is what Kees Christianse explained in his first principle. Elaboration, defining a flexible, very robust, basic structure for the development. And then you can see how it continued, and building fields, and then at the end, it was also an extension, and this was the result after this 3 years working in this field. Very important is also, we spoke today much about common spaces, public spaces, and private spaces. This definition in our cities is very important. And here I give you one example. Here, when they started to redevelop this area, first the architects defined what are the green, light green public spaces, what are the building fields, how the parcel should look like. And then they decided, okay, these are the parcels, and inside there will be a neighborhood way that the neighbors have their individual common space in between. And then the buildings were done, and at the corners, larger buildings, and this is how it looks today. So we can see with this tool, defining what is public, what is private, what is common, we create qualities in our cities. And as stronger this separation is, as more urban a situation is. Placemaking, of course, is very important. We heard this already, and here just an example from the small town Cottbus, time of the unification and the square today. And here at the end, I would just like to give you one more example where I combined these principles, placemaking, composition of different urban elements, and designing the dialogue between buildings and space. Here you can see, this is a project we are just doing, a conversion of an old industrial area. The dark gray buildings are heritage buildings or just old buildings. The white ones are new buildings, and the red places are places for the neighborhood squares. So a dialogue between the objects and the space create individual spaces for the people to live in, and combine this with the structure, and then you have the space for more individual development. And here you see this composition, how dealing with different typologies. If there would be only row houses, it would be boring. If there would be only these elephants, it would be chaotic. Bringing them into a composition makes it attractive. And here, at the end, I just would highlight this also in the traditional town. There were not only the space definers and the occupiers. Here in Venice, at the St. Mark's Square, the St. Mark's Cathedral is one object, but it's inside the urban fabric. But it makes one step forward to show, if you come here from the ocean, here something specific is. On the other side, the building structure is framing, defining very clearly the space. And if you see this follow-up of spaces, this is great urban design. So, and with these tools, knowing about these tools and elements, we are able to qualify our cities. And this is the last example, small scale. This is really, I have a passion for this. In our towns today, we build too many large structures. We need much more smaller structures based on smaller parcels. And we as the urban planners are the only one who are taking care about that. Because the architects, they prefer to build large. The investors, they always want to build large. The politicians, they don't know. We as the urban planners must look that small-scale urbanism brings much more mixture of function, different times of aging, different clients, different social groups, and on the long run, much more sustainable development. Here you see this, an example from Freiburg, and the houses for that, it's a conversion of an old military area. With this, I come to the conclusion, the preservation and the development of original structures, identity and character of the town and their districts is getting more and more important, especially to be competitive or to be strong in the competition between our cities. Only unique cities with unique districts can succeed in this international competition. And radical transformation to a new urban quality should be seen with doubts. And iterative development, cell by cell, is rather better than instant large interventions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Christoph. Я думаю, що після такої лекції ми всі трошки стали гончарами.
After this lecture, we have become potters.
Yes, you are great. And I also wanted to mention that one time we discussed about what is a specificity of semi-public space, and I mentioned this semi-public space, and you said, man, forget about this notion of semi-public space. And I said, why? Because it's common space. Why not semi-public? Because I hate everything that is semi. Very nice quote. So, можливо, хтось із вас має питання?
Maybe some of you have questions. Well, we have enough time just for one key question. You were the first one. We are really behind the schedule. So just one question. Greetings once again. A very interesting and stimulating comparison of public spaces with the clay jars where you have hollow spaces. So I have the following question. What is the commonality between this Ukrainian clay pot and German clay pot, and what is the differentiating point between the Ukrainian clay pot and the German one?
Is there any difference in terms of spaces inside the German cities and Ukrainian cities? How the spaces are structured and formed?
Саме в публічних просторах.
I'm asking about public spaces.
So, of course, there are many differences, but from the typologies, from the general characteristics, they are all European cities. So if I would be now in the Arab world, we have a totally different traditional system of public space, of urban fabric. Then I could tell you, oh, there are these significant differences. But here, there are plenty small differences depending on the topography, on culture, on usage of ground floors, of importance of specific buildings. But in general, the types, this is the same. The structures are very, very similar. It's European cities.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Thank you.